Good evening, friends. Tonight we're embarking on a journey through the shadows of medieval history, where the line between legend and truth becomes impossibly thin. Settle into your chair, dim the lights around you, and prepare yourself for something extraordinary. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't fiction. These aren't fairy tales invented by imaginative monks or exaggerated campfire stories. These are the documented truths hiding behind history's most unbelievable myths. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're joining me from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below and let me know. There's something magical about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, united by curiosity about the past. And if you enjoy exploring these hidden truths with me, go ahead and give this video a like. It helps more history lovers find their way here. Now, let me ask you something. When you think about medieval myths, what comes to mind? Dragon slayers and enchanted swords? Witches casting spells in moonlit forests? Giants and monsters lurking in the depths of ancient woods? For centuries, scholars looked at these stories and smiled knowingly, certain they understood the truth. Medieval people, they thought, were superstitious and primitive. They couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. They believed in magic because they didn't understand science. But here's the uncomfortable truth that modern archaeology and forensic science have forced us to confront. Our medieval ancestors weren't primitive at all. They were careful observers of the world around them, recording phenomena they couldn't fully explain but absolutely experienced. When they wrote about warriors who couldn't feel pain, about plagues that made people dance until they died, about children with green skin appearing from underground realms, they weren't fabricating fantasies. They were documenting realities that seemed impossible, yet undeniably occurred. The fire crackles softly in the hearth tonight as we prepare to examine these mysteries one by one. We'll walk through the archaeological evidence, study the historical documents, and consult with modern scientists who've spent years trying to understand how these seemingly impossible events actually happened. What we're going to discover together is that truth is often stranger, more disturbing, and infinitely more fascinating than any legend could ever be. Let me start with something that sounds completely fantastical. Imagine warriors who could transform themselves into bears and wolves, who fought in supernatural frenzies that made them immune to pain and fear, who terrified entire armies into fleeing at the mere sight of them. For over 1,000 years, historians dismissed these accounts as obvious mythology. Warriors who turn into animals? Men who become unstoppable killing machines through spiritual transformation? Come on. That's clearly just Viking propaganda designed to frighten their enemies. Except it wasn't propaganda at all. The berserkers were absolutely real, and the truth behind their legendary fury turns out to be far more sophisticated and far more disturbing than the myths ever suggested. As we move deeper into the night, let me tell you about the first of our shocking discoveries. Picture a Viking longship approaching the coast of England in the year 873. The morning mist hangs low over the water, and from the beach, Saxon warriors watch the approaching vessel with growing dread. They can hear something carried across the waves. Not war cries, not battle songs, something far more unsettling. Howling. Animal sounds emerging from human throats. As the ship draws closer, they see figures on deck, men wearing the skins of bears and wolves, moving with a strange, convulsive energy that seems barely contained. These were the berserkers, and their reputation had spread across medieval Europe like a dark tide. The Old Norse sagas describe them in detail that seems too extraordinary to believe. They fought without armour, biting their shields in fury, howling like beasts, seemingly immune to wounds that would drop normal men instantly. They could fight for hours without tiring, their strength apparently multiplied tenfold by whatever possessed them. Enemy soldiers reported that berserkers felt no pain, showed no fear, and displayed a savagery that seemed inhuman. The word itself gives us our first real clue about what was actually happening. Berserker comes from Old Norse, meaning either bare shirt or bare skin, depending on which etymology you follow. But both interpretations point to the same essential truth. These weren't just warriors wearing costumes. They believed they were channeling the spirit of the bear itself, transforming into something beyond human through carefully guarded rituals. For centuries, rational historians looked at these accounts and saw obvious exaggeration. Warriors don't transform into animals. People can't become immune to pain through spiritual practices. The whole thing was clearly just poetic embellishment, good stories that got better with each retelling. The berserkers, if they existed at all, were probably just particularly brave or reckless fighters whose exploits got inflated over time. Then archaeologists started digging into Viking burial sites and everything changed. What they found wasn't just weapons and treasure. They found carefully preserved bear and wolf pelts buried alongside warriors in positions suggesting these animal skins weren't decorative. They were sacred objects, positioned with the same reverence as swords and shields. Some graves contained specialized pottery that chemical analysis revealed had been used for preparing and storing psychoactive compounds. The evidence was mounting that the berserkers weren't myth at all. The breakthrough came when researchers began investigating the pharmacological possibilities available in medieval Scandinavia. The forests of Norway, Sweden and Denmark are home to a particular species of mushroom that would have been intimately familiar to Viking-age peoples, Amanita muscaria, commonly called the fly agaric mushroom. This isn't just any fungus. Amanita muscaria contains compounds called muscimol and ibotenic acid that produce powerful psychoactive effects remarkably consistent with the symptoms described in historical accounts of berserker fury. Users of Amanita muscaria report feelings of superhuman strength, though this is partly perceptual and partly real, as the compounds suppress the body's normal safety mechanisms that prevent us from exerting our full physical potential. They report complete fearlessness, dissociation from pain that can last for hours, visual and auditory hallucinations, uncontrollable rage, and perhaps most significantly, the sensation of transforming into animals. These aren't vague similarities. These are point-by-point matches with how medieval sources describe berserker behaviour. Contemporary accounts from the enemies of Vikings provide remarkable consistency. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who had every incentive to portray Vikings as demonic invaders, nonetheless provides descriptions that sound like careful observation rather than propaganda. Men who howled like wolves and barked like dogs, warriors who bit their shields and chewed the rims until their mouths bled, fighters who seemed to shrug off wounds that should have been instantly fatal. One particularly detailed account comes from Byzantine sources, where Viking mercenaries served in the elite Varangian Guard protecting the emperor. A Byzantine chronicler describes watching these northern warriors prepare for battle by consuming what he calls sacred mushrooms. He notes with disturbing precision that they would foam at the mouth, their eyes would roll back in their heads, and they would speak in tongues that no interpreter could understand. But most remarkably, he describes the aftermath. After battles, these warriors had to be physically restrained by their comrades until the effects wore off, sometimes attacking their own allies in their continued fury. Modern research into Amanita muscaria has revealed something fascinating. The mushroom's effects can be controlled and enhanced through specific preparation methods. Fresh mushrooms produce different effects than dried ones. Mushrooms prepared through fermentation create yet another profile of experiences. Some preparations induce calm, focused states. Others create the violent, uncontrollable fury described in the sagas. Archaeological evidence suggests Viking-age peoples were sophisticated pharmacologists who understood these distinctions perfectly. Excavations have uncovered specialized vessels that appear designed for preparing these substances. Chemical analysis of residues confirms the presence of compounds consistent with processed Amanita muscaria. Even more remarkably, Some vessels have been found alongside what appear to be instruction sets. Runic inscriptions describing preparation methods, dosages, and even warnings about potential dangers. The knowledge of how to create berserker fury wasn't random or accidental. It was carefully guarded expertise passed down through generations of warrior shamans. But the berserkers weren't simply drug-fueled madmen charging blindly into battle. They were elite warriors who underwent years of training to learn how to harness and control their altered states. The sagas describe elaborate initiation rituals that could last for months. Young warriors would learn to wear the bear or don the wolf through processes involving fasting, meditation, physical conditioning, and psychological preparation. The goal wasn't just fearlessness, it was transcendence, becoming something more than human. Historical sources describe berserkers fighting for hours without visible exhaustion, ignoring wounds that incapacitated normal men, and inspiring such terror that entire armies would flee rather than face them. While some of this was undoubtedly exaggeration, modern understanding of Amanita muscaria's effects suggests much might have been literally true. The compounds affect the central nervous system in ways that suppress pain responses and override psychological mechanisms that normally prevent dangerous physical exertion. Yet there was a devastating dark side that the sagas often gloss over. The same altered states that made berserkers so effective in battle made them dangerous to their own communities. Multiple accounts describe berserkers who couldn't control their fury, who turned on their own allies, who remained in altered states long after battles ended. Some sources tell of warriors who had to be locked away after fights, who would attack anyone approaching them until the mushroom effect finally subsided. Others describe warriors who became addicted to their transformations, consuming the sacred mushroom so frequently they lost the ability to function in normal society. This may explain why berserker culture eventually vanished from Scandinavian society. As Viking communities became more settled and Christianized, there was less tolerance for warriors who might turn violent without warning. The old ways of the bear warriors were gradually suppressed and finally lost. But their legacy endured in ways both obvious and subtle. The word berserk entered the English language as a description of uncontrolled fury. The image of the unstoppable warrior immune to pain and fear became central to heroic literature across cultures, and the idea that human beings could transcend normal limitations through spiritual or chemical means became a recurring theme throughout Western history. Modern military researchers have actually studied historical berserker accounts as part of investigations into combat effectiveness and warrior psychology. Some findings are deeply disturbing. It appears the berserker state, while effective in battle, came at tremendous psychological cost. Many warriors who regularly entered these altered states showed signs of what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health conditions. Archaeological evidence supports these conclusions. Skeletal remains of individuals buried with berserker regalia often show signs of chronic stress, malnutrition, and injuries suggesting self-harm. The price of becoming more than human was often the loss of one's humanity. As we sit by the fire tonight thinking about those ancient warriors who discovered how to push beyond normal human limits, we might ask ourselves what they really achieved. They became legends, certainly, but they also became cautionary tales about the cost of transformation. The berserkers prove that the human mind and body can indeed transcend ordinary limitations, but they also proved that some boundaries exist for good reasons. Their story isn't just about mushrooms or violence. It's about the eternal human temptation to become something more than we are, and the question of whether that transformation is worth the price we pay. The flames in our hearth burn lower now as we prepare to move to our next mystery. Because the berserkers weren't the only medieval people who discovered that the human body could be pushed into states that seemed supernatural. Our next story takes us to a French city on a sweltering summer day, where something began that would claim hundreds of lives through the simple, impossible act of dancing. The summer of 1518 descended on Strasbourg like a fever. The city, nestled in what is now the border region between France and Germany, was already struggling. Harvests had failed, bread prices had tripled, disease moved through the crowded streets with grim efficiency. But nothing could have prepared the citizens for what began on a July morning when a woman named Frau Trofea stepped out of her house and began to dance. This wasn't celebration. This wasn't joy. Frau Trofea moved with a desperate, compulsive energy that seemed to possess her entire being. Her arms jerked, her legs kicked, her body twisted in movements that looked more like convulsions than choreography. Hour after hour she continued, her face frozen in something between ecstasy and terror. Neighbours gathered to watch, first amused, then concerned, finally horrified as the sun set and Frau Trofea kept dancing through the darkness. By morning, her feet were bleeding through her shoes. Her movements had become less controlled, more violent. She seemed unable to stop, unable even to slow down. Family members tried to restrain her, but she fought them off with surprising strength, returning immediately to her frenzied movements. The local priest was summoned, then a physician, but neither could explain what was happening or make it stop. Within 3 days, something even more inexplicable began. Others started dancing, not in sympathy or mockery, but with the same desperate compulsion that had seized Frau Trofea. 12 people, then 24, then 50, all moving through the streets in that same terrible, uncontrolled frenzy, their bodies jerking and spinning as if controlled by invisible strings. The city authorities, faced with a crisis unlike anything in their experience, scrambled for solutions. They consulted physicians who were baffled. They brought in priests who declared it either divine punishment or demonic possession. They even, in what would prove to be a catastrophic decision, hired musicians and built stages. The theory was logical enough. If these people needed to dance, perhaps providing proper music and space would help them dance it out of their systems. The opposite happened. The music and stages seemed to intensify the compulsion. More people joined the dancing. The movements became more violent, more uncontrolled. People began dying, not just from exhaustion, but from heart attacks, strokes, and injuries sustained during their involuntary movements. By August, city records document over 400 people seized by this dancing plague, and the death toll was climbing daily. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that sound like nightmares. Dancers moving through streets in formations, their movements synchronized not by plan but by whatever force drove them. People collapsing from exhaustion, then rising to dance again the moment they regained consciousness. Families desperately trying to force food and water into loved ones who couldn't stop, moving long enough to eat or drink. Bodies piling up as the stronger succumbed to what their bodies couldn't endure. For centuries, historians dismissed this as obvious exaggeration or outright fabrication. The idea that hundreds of people could literally dance themselves to death seemed too absurd to take seriously. Medieval chroniclers, they assumed, were prone to sensationalism. Surely this was just a minor incident blown wildly out of proportion, or perhaps a complete invention designed to illustrate some moral lesson about the dangers of excess. Then researchers began examining the original documents more carefully, and the dismissive certainty evaporated. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't documented by a single chronicler or in one sensationalized account. It appeared in city council records, tax documents, church registers, and personal letters from multiple independent sources. The city of Strasbourg maintained meticulous records because they were dealing with a public health crisis that threatened to destroy their economy. They documented the dances, the deaths, the interventions attempted, and the final toll with bureaucratic precision. More disturbing still, Strasbourg wasn't unique. Similar outbreaks had occurred throughout medieval Europe. In 1374, a dancing epidemic swept through the Rhine Valley, affecting thousands across multiple cities. In 1428, A nun in a German convent began dancing uncontrollably, and within days her entire sisterhood had joined her. In 1463, children in the town of Erfurt began dancing in the streets, and the epidemic spread to neighbouring communities. Each outbreak followed similar patterns and produced similar documentation. Modern researchers have developed a compelling explanation that combines several factors. The first is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet, cool conditions. When consumed, it produces compounds chemically similar to LSD, causing hallucinations, convulsions, and uncontrollable muscle spasms. The symptoms of ergot poisoning, known in medieval times as St. Anthony's fire, include exactly the kind of involuntary movements described in dancing plague accounts. But ergot alone doesn't explain the contagious nature of these outbreaks, or their specific focus on dancing behaviour. This is where mass psychogenic illness enters the picture. Also called mass hysteria, this is a well-documented phenomenon where psychological symptoms spread through a population via social contagion. When communities are under extreme stress from famine, disease, or social upheaval, they become particularly vulnerable to this kind of collective psychological breakdown. The dancing plagues occur during periods of intense social stress in medieval Europe. The 14th through 16th centuries were marked by recurring famines, devastating plagues including the Black Death, religious conflicts, and social upheaval. Communities often existed on the edge of survival, and people were desperate for explanations for their suffering and ways to cope with their terror. In this context, dancing may have served as both symptom of distress and attempted cure. Many medieval cultures associated dancing with healing, spiritual purification, and communication with the divine. When people faced inexplicable suffering, dancing may have seemed like a way to appease angry gods, purge sin from the community, or achieve religious ecstasy that would provide relief from earthly troubles. But what started as coping mechanism quickly became trap. The physical stress of prolonged dancing combined with psychological pressure of public performance and social expectation to continue created a feedback loop nearly impossible to break. People who might have recovered from their initial distress instead found themselves locked into patterns of behaviour that were literally killing them. Recent research has revealed the dancing plagues weren't random events. They followed specific social and cultural patterns. They were more likely to occur in communities already experiencing high stress levels, in areas where traditional social structures were breaking down, and among populations with strong cultural associations between dancing and spiritual or healing practices. The outbreaks also affected certain demographic groups disproportionately. Women were overrepresented among dancers, as were young people and individuals from lower social classes. Perhaps most remarkably, some dancing plague outbreaks appear to have been deliberately induced or manipulated by religious or political authorities. There are records of priests and civic leaders who encouraged dancing epidemics as ways of channeling social unrest, providing outlets for popular frustration that were less threatening to established power structures than open rebellion. The dancing plague of Strasbourg finally burned itself out in September of 1518, as suddenly as it had begun. Survivors returned to normal behaviour as if awakening from dreams, often with a little memory of their time as dancers. The city was left to count its dead and try to understand what had happened. They never fully succeeded, and neither have we. What the dancing plague teaches us is that the boundary between individual and collective experience, between sanity and madness, between physical and psychological suffering, is far less clear than we like to believe. It shows us that human beings are deeply connected to each other in ways that can be both beautiful and terrifying. And it reminds us that when communities are pushed to their breaking points, the results can be stranger than any fiction. As we move deeper into the night, listening to the wind outside our windows, we might spare a thought for Frau Trophäa and the hundreds who danced with her. They weren't possessed by demons. They weren't punished by God. They, were human beings caught in a perfect storm of biological, psychological, and social factors that trapped them in movements they couldn't control. Their tragedy reminds us that sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't external threats. Sometimes they're the ones our own minds and bodies create. The fire crackles softly as we prepare for our next story, and this one involves children, thousands of them, who believed with absolute conviction that God had called them to save the Holy Land. Their faith was pure, their intentions were noble, and the reality of what happened to them was darker than any nightmare. The summer of 1212 began with visions. In the French countryside near Chartres, a shepherd boy named Stephen claimed that Christ had appeared to him while he tended his flock. The vision was specific and compelling. Jesus, disguised as a pilgrim, had handed Stephen a letter commanding him to preach a new crusade. But this crusade would be different from the bloody military campaigns that had preceded it. This one would be led by children, whose innocence and purity would succeed where adult warriors had failed catastrophically. Stephen's message spread through the French countryside with remarkable speed. The Mediterranean Sea would part before the children just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. They would walk dry across the waves to Jerusalem. Once there, their very presence would convert the Muslims to Christianity, making military conquest unnecessary. It was a vision that combined biblical precedent with contemporary religious fervour, and it proved extraordinarily compelling to a population desperate for hope. Within weeks, children from across northern France were abandoning their homes and families to join what they believed would be a miraculous journey. Contemporary sources describe streams of children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, walking along the roads toward Paris, where Stephen had promised to gather his army of young crusaders. They came from all social classes. Peasant children left their family farms, merchant children abandoned their apprenticeships, even noble children slipped away from tutors and guardians to join the march. What makes this even more remarkable is that it wasn't happening only in France. At almost exactly the same time, a parallel movement was developing in Germany, led by a boy named Nicholas who claimed his own divine vision. The German Children's Crusade followed a different route, planning to cross the Alps into Italy and then sail from the port of Genoa to the Holy Land. 2 separate movements, in 2 different countries, inspired by 2 different child prophets, all happening within months of each other. For centuries, historians assumed these parallel movements were either completely fictional or greatly exaggerated. The idea that thousands of children could spontaneously organize themselves into 2 crusading armies seemed impossible. Medieval society was highly structured and controlled. Children didn't just wander off on religious missions without adult supervision and support. The whole story seemed like obvious fabrication, perhaps a morality tale about the dangers of religious enthusiasm, or a metaphor for spiritual purity. But recent research into medieval records has revealed something disturbing. The Children's Crusade wasn't myth or metaphor. It actually happened, and it happened more or less exactly as the sources describe. Archaeological excavations along the routes taken by the Child Crusaders have uncovered evidence of large groups of people moving through the countryside during the summer of 1212. Monastery records show unusual numbers of children seeking food and shelter during this period. Church documents record special prayers and services held for what they called the innocent crusaders. Even more compelling is the documentary evidence that has survived in various archives across Europe. City records from Paris describe the arrival of what they call multitudes of children led by a young shepherd claiming divine authority. Italian chronicles record the passage of German children through the Alpine passes. Port records from Marseille and Genoa document attempts by groups of children to secure passage to the Holy Land. These aren't vague legends. These are bureaucratic records created for administrative purposes by people who had no reason to fabricate stories about wandering children. The early 13th century was marked by widespread belief in the imminent end of the world, popular religious movements that challenged established church authority, and growing frustration with the failure of official crusades to recapture Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, which had ended in 1204, had been a particular disaster. Instead of liberating the Holy Land, the Crusaders had sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. This betrayal of Christian unity had shocked and disillusioned many believers who began looking for alternative ways to serve God. Into this atmosphere of religious crisis came the message of the child prophets. Innocence and faith could succeed where military might have failed. It was a message that resonated powerfully with people who had lost faith in the established church hierarchy and traditional methods of crusading. And it wasn't just children who were caught up in the movement. Many adults joined the marches, some as protectors, others as opportunists who saw chances for profit. The French children led by Stephen made it as far as Marseille, where they expected the Mediterranean Sea to part before them. When this miracle failed to occur, the movement began to collapse. Some children tried to return home, but many had travelled too far and were too weak to make the journey back. Others were approached by merchants who offered to transport them to the Holy Land by ship. According to later testimony, these merchants were not motivated by charity. They sold the children into slavery in North African markets. The German children faced an even worse fate. Those who survived the crossing of the Alps, and many didn't, succumbing to exposure, starvation and disease in the mountain passes, found themselves stranded in Italian ports with no way to continue their journey. Some were taken in by local monasteries or charitable organisations, but many simply disappeared into the underworld of medieval urban poverty, their fates unrecorded and unremembered. Recent research has uncovered evidence confirming what the medieval chroniclers claimed. Documents from North African markets record the sale of young European slaves during the period immediately following the Children's Crusade. Ship manifests from Italian ports show vessels departing for Muslim territories, with human cargo matching the description of the missing crusaders. The children who set out believing God would protect them ended up as property, sold to the highest bidder by the very adults who had promised to help them. Perhaps most disturbing is evidence that the Children's Crusade may not have been as spontaneous as it appeared. Some historians now believe the movement was deliberately encouraged and manipulated by adults who saw opportunity to profit from children's religious enthusiasm. There are records of merchants who provided food and supplies to the child crusaders at inflated prices that left families bankrupt. There are accounts of ship captains who promised to transport children to the Holy Land for free, only to sell them into slavery once they were aboard. There are even suggestions that some church officials encouraged the movement as a way of channeling popular religious fervour away from more threatening forms of dissent. This darker interpretation is supported by what we know about medieval attitudes toward children and childhood. In the 13th century, children were not seen as innocent beings who needed protection and nurturing. They were viewed as small adults who could be expected to work, fight and die for the same causes as their elders. The aftermath of the Children's Crusade was devastating for the families and communities that had lost their children. Parents who had initially been proud of their children's religious devotion were left to mourn sons and daughters who would never return home. Villages that had sent significant numbers of children found themselves facing labour shortages and demographic crises that lasted for generations. The Church was forced to grapple with the implications of what had happened. How could a movement that seemed so clearly inspired by divine revelation have ended in such tragedy? Some theologians argued that the children's faith had been pure, but that they had been led astray by false prophets and greedy merchants. Others suggested that the failure of the crusade was itself a divine message about the futility of trying to recapture the Holy Land through any means. The Children's Crusade also had lasting effects on European attitudes toward popular religious movements. Church authorities became much more suspicious of claims of divine revelation, especially when they came from children or other marginalized groups. New procedures were established for investigating and validating religious visions. Greater emphasis was placed on the importance of church hierarchy and institutional authority over individual spiritual experiences. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Children's Crusade was its impact on European literature and culture. The story of innocent children who set out to serve God and ended up as victims of adult greed and manipulation became a powerful symbol of lost innocence and betrayed faith. It inspired countless works of art, literature and music that explored themes of religious devotion, social exploitation, and the vulnerability of the young. The Children's Crusade serves as a reminder of how easily religious enthusiasm can be manipulated and exploited by those with less noble motives. The children who followed Stephen and Nicholas were sincere in their faith and genuine in their desire to serve God. But their innocence and naivety made them easy targets for adults who saw them as opportunities for profit, rather than as human beings deserving of protection and care. As we sit by the fire tonight thinking about those children who walk the roads of medieval Europe with such hope and faith, we might ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. How different is our world from theirs? Do we still see movements of popular enthusiasm manipulated by those in power? Do we still have vulnerable populations exploited by those who should be protecting them? The Children's Crusade reminds us that the line between faith and fanaticism, between inspiration and exploitation, between hope and tragedy, is often thinner than we would like to believe. The fire burns lower now as we move to our next mystery. This one involves a form of justice so strange that it seems to contradict everything we think we know about medieval superstition. Yet it worked with surprising effectiveness, and the reasons why tell us something profound about human psychology and the nature of truth itself. Imagine you're accused of theft in a medieval English village. There are no witnesses, no physical evidence, just suspicion and accusation. You proclaim your innocence, but words alone won't save you. Instead, you're brought before the village priest and told that God himself will judge your case. You must reach into a pot of boiling water and retrieve a stone from the bottom. Your hand will be bandaged, and in 3 days the bandages will be removed. If your burns have healed cleanly, you're innocent. If they've festered, you're guilty. This was trial by ordeal, a form of judicial procedure used throughout medieval Europe from roughly the 9th through the 13th centuries. And for generations, historians held it up as the perfect example of medieval irrationality. Here, they said, was proof positive that our ancestors were superstitious barbarians who believed God would literally intervene to prevent innocent people from getting burned. It was obviously primitive nonsense that produced random results and had nothing to do with actual guilt or innocence. Except recent research suggests that historians were completely wrong. Trial by ordeal wasn't random at all. It was actually a surprisingly effective justice system that combined religious theatre with sophisticated psychology to achieve accuracy rates that would impress modern courts. The key to understanding how it worked lies in recognizing that medieval people weren't naive about human nature. They understood things about community dynamics and psychological pressure that we're only beginning to rediscover today. Think about the context in which ordeals occurred. In a small medieval village, serious crimes rarely happened in complete secrecy. If someone stole the church silver or murdered the miller, chances were excellent that multiple people had strong suspicions about who did it. But nobody wanted to be the one to point fingers directly. Direct accusation could start blood feuds that lasted for generations and tear communities apart. So how do you resolve situations where everyone suspects someone but nobody wants to formally accuse them? Enter trial by ordeal, the ultimate community pressure cooker. The accused would spend days preparing for their divine test while the whole village watched and whispered. Church bells would ring, priests would pray, special masses would be held. Everyone would gather to witness God's judgment. The psychological pressure was enormous. You weren't just facing a simple test. You were facing your entire community, your God, and your own conscience all at once. Here's what modern research has discovered that's genuinely fascinating. Many people who went through trial by ordeal never actually touched the boiling water. They confessed before the ceremony was complete. The ritual itself, all that build-up, all that community scrutiny, All that time to contemplate meeting God with blood on your hands, cracked people who might never have admitted guilt under normal questioning. The ordeal functioned as an extraordinarily effective interrogation technique that used social pressure and religious fear rather than physical torture. For those who did go through with the ordeal, the results weren't as random as they seemed. Medical research has revealed something remarkable about the relationship between psychological state and physical healing. Innocent people, genuinely convinced of their innocence and their right relationship with God, approach the test with relative calm. Stress and anxiety actually make burns worse by affecting blood flow, immune response, and healing processes. Confident, relaxed people genuinely do heal faster from identical injuries. Guilty people, on the other hand, were often psychological wrecks by the time they reached the boiling pot. Medieval people truly believed God saw everything. They believed in literal hell. They believed their immortal souls were at stake. Facing what they thought would be direct divine judgment while carrying the weight of actual guilt was terrifying. That terror translated into stress responses that genuinely affected healing outcomes. Faster heart rates, elevated cortisol, reduced blood flow to extremities. All factors that medical science now knows impair wound healing. But the system had additional layers of sophistication that historians are only now appreciating. The priests and officials running these ordeals weren't naive. They had generations of experience reading people and understanding community dynamics. They had ways of influencing outcomes that fell short of outright fraud, but definitely tilted the scales. The water temperature could be adjusted slightly depending on assessment of the accused. The examination of wounds after 3 days was somewhat subjective. Innocent people often had family and friends providing good wound care during the waiting period, while guilty parties might find themselves mysteriously neglected. Archaeological evidence from medieval churches has uncovered specialised vessels for heating water and iron used in ordeals. Some show signs of having been treated with substances that would affect how hot they got, or how much damage they caused. There's even evidence of different types of stones being used, some smoother and easier to grab quickly, others rougher and requiring longer contact with hot water. The system had built-in flexibility that allowed experienced operators to nudge results toward what they believed was the truth, based on their assessment of the accused and community sentiment. Statistical analysis of historical records suggests trial by ordeal had accuracy rates around 85 to 90%. That's better than many modern justice systems, not because God was intervening, but because it was a carefully designed method for extracting confessions and applying accumulated community knowledge about who had actually committed crimes. The ordeal worked because it leveraged multiple sources of information simultaneously. The accused person's own knowledge of their guilt or innocence, the community's collective suspicions, the priest's experienced judgment, and yes, even some genuine correlation between psychological state and physical healing. Is this justice by modern standards? Absolutely not. The system was open to manipulation and abuse. Innocent people did sometimes fail ordeals, particularly if they were already marginalized or unpopular in their communities. The religious framework meant that losing an ordeal didn't just mean legal punishment. It meant public confirmation that God himself had judged you guilty. A stigma that could destroy lives even if you somehow survived the legal consequences. But for isolated communities with no forensic science, no professional police, no DNA testing, and no reliable methods for determining truth from testimony alone, trial by ordeal was a remarkably effective compromise. It provided a method for resolving disputes that everyone could accept as legitimate. It gave the accused a chance to prove their innocence in a way that seemed fair within the medieval worldview. And it actually worked more often than not, which is why it persisted for centuries across diverse cultures and legal systems. The decline of trial by ordeal came not because people suddenly realized it was ineffective, but because of changes in legal philosophy and church politics. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. This wasn't because church authorities thought ordeals didn't work, it was because they were uncomfortable with what they saw as forcing God to perform miracles on demand. Without priestly participation, ordeals lost their religious legitimacy and gradually disappeared from European legal systems. But elements of the psychology behind ordeals persist in modern justice systems. Polygraph tests, while not admissible in most courts, function similarly as psychological pressure devices that often elicit confessions regardless of their actual accuracy at detecting lies. The entire adversarial trial system relies partly on the belief that truth will emerge through rigorous questioning and public scrutiny. We've simply replaced divine judgment with human judgment, and the scientific trappings of forensic evidence with the religious trappings of ordeal ritual. As we move through the deepening night, thinking about those medieval villagers who heated water and said prayers and tried to determine truth through methods that seem alien to us, perhaps we should be less quick to judge their systems as primitive. They were solving real problems with the tools available to them. Their solutions were imperfect, sometimes terribly unjust, but also surprisingly effective. And their fundamental insight, that psychological pressure and community knowledge could be harnessed to reveal truth, remains valid even in our age of DNA evidence and forensic science. The fire crackles as we prepare to journey into our next mystery. This one takes us into the winter sky, where ghostly riders once thundered through storm clouds, terrifying entire villages into hiding. For centuries, scholars laughed at tales of the wild hunt. Then they discovered what people were actually seeing, and the explanation turned out to be stranger and more beautiful than the legend itself. Winter nights in medieval Europe were dark beyond anything we can easily imagine today. No streetlights, no electric glow bleeding into the sky from distant cities. Just profound darkness broken only by firelight and stars. So when strange lights appeared in that darkness, when sounds seemed to come from nowhere, when the sky itself seemed to come alive with movement and colour, the effect must have been absolutely terrifying. The wild hunt was one of medieval Europe's most widespread and persistent legends. Across different countries and cultures, people reported seeing ghostly cavalry thundering through winter skies. Spectral riders on pale horses, accompanied by baying hounds that weren't quite dogs, and hunting horns that echoed with otherworldly resonance. Witnesses described formations of lights moving across the heavens, shapes that seemed almost human but too large and too bright to be earthly. The sounds were equally disturbing. Thunder of hooves where no horses ran, horns blasting in perfect winter stillness, voices calling in languages that shouldn't exist. Villages developed elaborate rituals for protecting themselves from the wild hunt. When the signs appeared, when the wind picked up in a certain way, or the clouds took on particular formations, people would slam shutters, bar doors, and hide until the danger passed. Because according to legend, anyone who witnessed the hunt directly risked being swept up into it, carried away to ride forever with the dead, or struck down where they stood. Children were taught from early age to recognize the warning signs and seek shelter immediately. For centuries, scholars treated the wild hunt as obvious folklore. Thunder is thunder, they said. Wind is wind. Medieval people simply projected their fears onto natural phenomena because they didn't understand meteorology. The whole thing was superstitious nonsense, another example of primitive minds inventing supernatural explanations for ordinary weather events. Case closed. Then researchers started correlating historical accounts of wild hunt sightings with astronomical records and atmospheric data. What they discovered was remarkable. Many of these supernatural encounters coincided with specific celestial and atmospheric phenomena that would have created genuinely extraordinary sights and sounds in the night sky. The medieval witnesses weren't making things up. They were accurately describing real events they had no framework for understanding. The breakthrough came when scientists realized that many wild hunt reports matched descriptions of the aurora borealis, the northern lights. During periods of high solar activity, Auroral displays can appear much farther south than usual, reaching areas where they would be completely unfamiliar to local populations. Imagine living your entire life in France or Germany, never having seen or heard of auroras, and suddenly the night sky erupts with dancing lights that pulse and shift and move in formations. Medieval chroniclers described the wild hunt with remarkable consistency across different countries and languages. Lights that moved in formation across the sky, colours that shifted from pale white to deep red to greenish hues, the characteristic undulating motion that gives auroras their name, the way the lights seem to dance and pulse with their own rhythm. They were witnessing genuine celestial phenomena and interpreting them through the only framework available to them, their mythology of gods, spirits, and supernatural forces. But auroras alone don't explain all aspects of wild hunt sightings, particularly the sounds. This is where another atmospheric phenomenon enters the picture. Under unusual weather conditions, sounds can travel incredible distances through the air. Temperature inversions, wind patterns, and atmospheric layers can create what scientists call atmospheric ducting. Sounds that originate hundreds of miles away can be carried through the atmosphere and appear to come from directly overhead. The baying of real hunting dogs from distant estates, the thunder of actual cavalry on training exercises, even the calls of migrating birds travelling at high altitudes. All of these could be carried through atmospheric ducting and seem to originate in the sky itself. Combined with visual phenomena like auroras or unusual cloud formations lit by moonlight, these sounds would create a genuinely convincing impression of supernatural forces moving through the heavens. Archaeological evidence supports the interpretation that medieval people were responding to real phenomena. Excavations of medieval sites have uncovered ritual preparations for supernatural visitations, protective amulets buried at crossroads, offerings left at specific locations, specialized architecture designed to hide from or deflect unwanted otherworldly attention. These weren't random superstitions. They were systematic responses to experiences people were genuinely having. Some communities even developed organized hunt-watching activities, detailed records of when and where supernatural riders appeared, what form they took, what consequences followed. Medieval observers noted that certain atmospheric conditions made sightings more likely. Cold, clear nights with strong winds and unusual cloud formations. They documented seasonal patterns, recording that the hunt was most active during winter months, particularly around the solstice when nights were longest. They created complex interpretive frameworks for understanding different types of sightings. But here's where the story takes an even more interesting turn. Some medieval communities may have deliberately created artificial wild hunts. Archaeological evidence suggests certain groups organized ritual activities designed to simulate supernatural appearances. Coordinated riders wearing masks and carrying torches, hunters with trained dogs taught to bay in particular ways, musicians with horns creating eerie sounds. These fake hunts served multiple purposes. They could intimidate enemies during conflicts. A group convinced that supernatural forces opposed them would be demoralized before battle even began. They could reinforce religious authority. Church officials could stage apparent miracles or warnings from beyond. They could maintain cultural traditions. In areas being forcibly Christianized, artificial hunts allowed people to continue pre-Christian practices under supernatural disguise. Legal records include cases of people prosecuted for what the documents call counterfeiting the wild hunt, creating false supernatural appearances for fraudulent purposes. This suggests medieval authorities recognized the distinction between real and artificial phenomena, even when both seemed supernatural to untrained observers. They understood that atmospheric events could be mimicked, that psychology could be manipulated, that the appearance of supernatural intervention could be staged by clever humans. Their sophistication in distinguishing genuine anomalous events from deliberate fakery was considerably greater than modern stereotypes would suggest. The psychological dimensions are equally fascinating. Extreme weather, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress can create vivid hallucinations that seem completely real. Medieval people enduring harsh winters, military campaigns, or epidemic diseases would have been particularly susceptible to these experiences. Rather than dismissing such visions as mere delusion, medieval communities developed sophisticated frameworks for interpreting and responding to them. The wild hunt served as cultural mechanism for processing collective trauma, explaining natural disasters, and maintaining social cohesion in the face of inexplicable events. When terrible things happened, when crops failed or children died or war devastated communities, the wild hunt provided an explanation that made sense within the medieval worldview. The spirits were angry, the dead were restless, the natural and supernatural worlds were intersecting in dangerous ways. These explanations allowed communities to take action, to perform rituals and make offerings and feel they had some control over forces that seemed overwhelming. The hunt also functioned as an early warning system. Communities reporting wild hunt sightings often experienced actual disasters within months, not because supernatural riders caused these events, but because the atmospheric and social conditions that produced hunt sightings were also associated with increased risks. Unusual weather patterns that created auroras and sound ducting often preceded harsh winters or storms. Social stress that made people more likely to report supernatural experiences was often present in communities facing famine, disease, or conflict. Medieval observers were remarkably good at pattern recognition even without understanding underlying mechanisms. Their belief that the wild hunt foretold disaster was often accurate, not through supernatural causation, but because both phenomena were symptoms of larger environmental and social stresses. In this sense, the wild hunt legends preserved genuine predictive knowledge encoded in supernatural framework. As we move through the deepest hours of night, listening carefully to the wind outside our windows, we might hear echoes of those ancient witnesses. Our ancestors heard the same winds, saw the same strange lights dancing across winter skies, and created stories to make sense of phenomena that exceeded their understanding but not their observation. The ghostly riders may be gone from our skies, explained away by science and banished by electric lights. But their memory lingers as a reminder that the world is still full of wonders we don't fully understand. The flames in our hearth burn steadily as we turn to our next mystery. This one involves a figure so iconic, so immediately recognizable, that it's become synonymous with plague itself. The beaked mask, the long black coat, the staff tapping through empty streets. The plague doctor seemed like the embodiment of medieval medical ignorance, until researchers discovered that every element of that terrifying costume served a specific, scientifically sound purpose. Picture a street in 17th century Venice during an outbreak of bubonic plague. Bodies lie unattended. Houses are marked with red crosses warning of infection within. Most people who can afford to flee have already left the city. The wealthy are barricaded in their estates. The poor huddle in their homes, praying that the pestilence will pass them by. Then, through the morning mist, a figure appears that seems more demon than healer. Tall and impossibly thin in a long black coat that reaches to the ground. A wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face that isn't quite human. A mask with dark glass eyes that reflect no light and no mercy. And that beak, that grotesque curved beak projecting nearly a foot from the face, giving the wearer the appearance of some monstrous bird come to feast on the dying. This was the plague doctor, and the terror his appearance inspired was entirely by design. For generations, medical historians looked at plague doctors and saw everything wrong with medieval and early modern medicine. The costume seemed like elaborate theatre with no medical purpose beyond psychological intimidation. The beak was obviously pure superstition, based on the medieval belief that disease spread through bad air. The whole get-up appeared to be quackery dressed up in frightening costume. more likely to terrify patients than to heal them. Boy, were they wrong. Recent analysis of plague doctor equipment has revealed something remarkable. Every single element of that terrifying costume served a specific medical purpose. Many of the underlying principles were more scientifically sound than the treatments that replaced them. The plague doctors weren't theatrical charlatans. They were practitioners of surprisingly sophisticated protective medicine who understood contamination and transmission in ways that wouldn't be fully appreciated for centuries. Let's start with that bizarre beak, because it's the most visually striking and seemingly absurd element. The beak wasn't decorative. It was an early air filtration system. The hollow interior was packed with aromatic substances, dried flowers, herbs, camphor, myrrh, rose petals, cloves, cinnamon, and dozens of other materials that medieval and Renaissance physicians believed could purify corrupted air. While we now know plague spreads primarily through fleas rather than bad air, the beak's filtration system was actually remarkably effective at reducing exposure to multiple airborne pathogens. Chemical analysis of surviving masks has revealed sophisticated understanding of antimicrobial compounds. Rosemary and thyme contain natural antibiotics. Certain spices have genuine antiseptic properties. Even some of the more exotic ingredients like powdered gemstones and rare minerals may have had legitimate protective effects based on their chemical properties. The combination of materials created a multi-layered filtration system that reduced the plague doctor's exposure to various disease vectors beyond just the plague itself. But the beak served another crucial function that researchers only recently appreciated. It created physical distance between the doctor and the patient. That extra foot of space reduced the likelihood of transmission through respiratory droplets, exactly the same principle behind modern social distancing during infectious disease outbreaks. Medieval physicians didn't understand the germ theory of disease, but they understood through careful observation that maintaining distance from the sick reduced the chances of becoming sick yourself. The long leather coat was treated with wax, animal fat, or other waterproofing agents to create a smooth, non-porous surface that pathogens couldn't easily stick to, and that could be cleaned and disinfected between patients. Modern microbiological research confirms this approach was remarkably effective. Bacteria and viruses have difficulty adhering to waxy surfaces. They can be easily removed with simple cleaning. The waterproofing also prevented bodily fluids from soaking through to the doctor's skin and clothing underneath. The coat extended all the way to the ground and was worn with boots and gloves, creating a complete barrier that covered every inch of skin. This wasn't superstition. It was practical barrier protection based on the observation that plague seemed to spread through contact. The dark colour wasn't just for dramatic effect. It was practical. Stains and contamination were less visible on black fabric, and the psychological effect of the ominous appearance actually served a purpose in maintaining professional distance. Computer modelling based on the plague doctor costume design has shown that the overall ensemble created airflow patterns that directed potentially contaminated air away from the physician's body. The beak mask created positive air pressure that prevented inhalation of dangerous particles. The wide-brimmed hat deflected materials falling from above. The long coat channeled airflow downward and away. The multiple layers of protection made accidental exposure extremely unlikely. But the costume served purposes beyond physical protection. The frightening appearance created psychological distance that allowed doctors to work with dying patients without becoming overwhelmed by emotion. The mask literally separated the physician from the human suffering they witnessed, allowing them to focus on medical tasks rather than becoming paralyzed by grief. This emotional protection was crucial for maintaining the stamina needed to treat patients day after day during outbreaks that could last for months. The dramatic look also served as professional identification during chaos. When plague struck, normal social structures collapsed, people fled, families abandoned sick members, strangers refused to help strangers. The distinctive costume allowed plague doctors to move safely through infected areas and gain access to patients who might otherwise be left to die alone. The outfit was instantly recognizable even from a distance, allowing people to know help was coming or to get out of the way if they wanted to avoid the doctor. Demographic analysis of plague mortality shows that communities with active plague doctors had significantly lower death rates than those without medical care. While Renaissance physicians couldn't cure plague, their interventions made meaningful differences in survival rates. Pain relief kept patients comfortable and reduced stress that weakened immune systems. Wound care prevented secondary infections. Nutritional support maintained strength. Basic sanitation reduced transmission within households. These simple measures delivered by physicians protected enough to continue working throughout outbreaks, saved lives. The ceremonial aspects weren't empty ritual either. Many plague doctors were also clergy or worked closely with religious authorities. Their work was understood as spiritual ministry as much as medical practice. The bird-like appearance may have been intended to evoke ravens or other carrion birds associated with death and transition in European symbolism, acknowledging the spiritual dimensions of their calling, while also serving practical protective purposes. Archaeological excavations of plague pits and hospital sites have uncovered equipment used by plague doctors, specialized tools for examining patients at a distance, containers for carrying medicines and aromatics, even early versions of thermometers for assessing fever without direct contact. The sophistication of these instruments reveals medical practitioners who were constantly innovating, trying to find better ways to protect themselves while still providing care. During the recent global pandemic, healthcare workers noted striking similarities between their protective equipment and historical plague doctor costumes. Modern hazmat suits, respirators, face shields, and gloves serve essentially the same functions as the medieval physician's leather coat, beaked mask, and dark glasses. The psychological challenges facing modern healthcare workers during infectious disease outbreaks also echo plague doctor experiences, maintaining professional detachment while witnessing massive suffering, using protective protocols for both physical safety and emotional survival, relying on distinctive medical clothing as both practical protection and professional identity. The plague doctor costume began to disappear in the 18th century, not because it was ineffective, but because plague itself became less common in Europe, and medical practice began to emphasize different approaches. As germ theory developed, physicians abandoned the miasma theory of disease that had justified the aromatic beak. As medical practice became more institutional, the solo practitioner wandering plague-stricken streets gave way to hospital-based care. The dramatic costume came to be seen as old-fashioned and superstitious, even though its basic principles were sound. But the plague doctor's legacy lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. The beaked mask has become one of history's most iconic images, instantly recognizable even to people who know nothing about medical history. It appears in art, literature, and popular culture as a symbol of pestilence, death, and the thin line between healing and harm. And in every modern healthcare worker who dons protective equipment before entering an isolation room, we see echoes of those Renaissance physicians who understood that caring for the sick requires protecting the caregiver. As we move deeper into the night, thinking about those masked figures who walked fearlessly into plague houses while others fled, we might reflect on what their example teaches us about the relationship between knowledge and practice, between understanding and effective action. Plague doctors didn't understand germ theory, but they understood contamination. They didn't know about bacteria and viruses, but they knew about barrier protection. They didn't have modern pharmaceuticals, but they had careful observation, systematic record keeping, and courage to keep trying new approaches when old ones failed. Their strange costumes may have looked supernatural, but they were actually examples of evidence-based medicine at its finest. Practical solutions developed through experience, tested through trial and error, refined through generations of practice. The beaked masks are gone from our hospitals, but their spirit lives on in every healthcare worker who puts on protective equipment and walks into danger to care for others. The fire crackles softly as we prepare for our next mystery. This one involves children who appeared where they shouldn't have been, speaking a language no one recognized, with skin coloured in a way that seemed impossible. For centuries, their story was dismissed as obvious fantasy. Then researchers began investigating the medical and historical evidence, and the green children of Woolpit turned out to be both stranger and more explicable than anyone had imagined. In the harvest season of the year 1173, workers in the fields near the English village of Woolpit made a discovery that would perplex chroniclers for centuries. Near the ancient wolf-trapping pits that gave the village its name, they found two children huddled together, weak and disoriented. But these weren't ordinary lost children separated from their families. Their skin was completely green, not painted or stained, but naturally coloured in a way none of the villagers had ever witnessed before. The children spoke no English, no French, no Latin. The sounds emerging from their mouths resembled no language anyone in Suffolk had ever encountered. They wore clothes made of unfamiliar materials in styles that matched nothing the villagers recognised. They refused all normal food, turning away from bread, meat and vegetables with what seemed like genuine revulsion. They appeared weak and terrified, as if they had travelled impossibly far, or suffered some terrible ordeal that had left them in this strange condition. The local lord, Sir Richard de Calne, took them into his household and tried to care for them. For weeks, the children would accept only raw broad beans, eating them desperately as if starving. Gradually, very gradually, they began to accept other foods. As their diet expanded, something remarkable happened. The green coloration of their skin began to fade. Not immediately, not completely, but over months their skin tone shifted towards something close to normal, though it retained a slight olive tinge that never entirely disappeared. The boy, who seemed younger and had been more severely affected by whatever they had endured, remained sickly despite the improved diet. He died within a few months of being found, but the girl survived, and as she learned English over the course of several years, she provided explanations for their origins that raised more questions than they answered. She claimed they came from a land of perpetual twilight, where everyone had green skin like theirs. She said they had been following their father's cattle when they heard bells and followed the sound through underground passages till they emerged into the bright sunlight of what she called the Land of Light. For centuries, historians treated this account as obvious fiction, a charming fairy tale that somehow got recorded as if it were fact. Green-skinned children appearing from underground realms, a land of perpetual twilight. It seemed like textbook medieval allegory, perhaps a story about purgatory or fairies that later writers mistook for historical record. Surely no one actually believed this happened as described. But here's what makes the story genuinely fascinating. It wasn't recorded by a single fanciful chronicler looking to spice up a slow news year. Two independent and generally reliable medieval historians documented the Green Children. Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh both recorded the story, and both claimed to have spoken with witnesses who had seen the children. These weren't fantasy writers. They were careful chroniclers who usually distinguish between reliable accounts and dubious rumours. Modern researchers have generated numerous theories, but the most medically plausible explanation focuses on a condition called hyperchromic anemia. This is severe anemia caused by extreme malnutrition, particularly iron deficiency. In advanced cases, hyperchromic anemia can indeed give skin a distinctly greenish pallor. If the children had been surviving on extremely limited vegetation, particularly if their diet consisted largely of raw beans and other legumes, they might well have developed nutritional deficiencies severe enough to cause green discoloration. This theory gains credibility from what happened after the children were found. As the girl's diet improved, her colour returned toward normal. This is exactly what we would expect if the green skin resulted from severe nutritional deficiency. The boy's death also fits the pattern. Severe malnutrition is often fatal in young children, particularly if they have been malnourished for extended periods before intervention. His body may simply have been too weakened to recover even with proper nutrition. But if malnutrition explains the green skin, it doesn't explain everything. How did they get to Woolpit? Why didn't they speak English or any recognisable language? Where did they really come from? Some researchers suggest they were Flemish refugees who had become separated from their families during the 12th century political upheavals that sent waves of refugees across the English Channel. The Flemish spoke a language completely foreign to English villagers. They might have had different dietary customs that seemed strange to their rescuers. The land of St. Martin that the girl described after learning English could reference a real Flemish settlement dedicated to St. Martin of Tours. Archaeological evidence shows significant immigration by Flemish refugees to the Woolpit area during the 12th century. Political disruptions, including conflicts and persecutions, could have displaced families and separated children from parents. The underground passages might have been real caves, mine workings, or even covered drainage systems where lost children could become trapped and disoriented. More exotic theories suggest environmental poisoning from medieval mining operations. Chronic copper poisoning can cause greenish skin discoloration. Exposure to various metals can produce disorientation, memory loss, and changes in dietary preferences. If the children came from an area contaminated by mining waste, their strange appearance and behaviour might result from chronic heavy metal exposure combined with malnutrition from living in a poisoned environment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect isn't what caused their green skin. It's how medieval society responded. The villagers didn't drive the children away as demons or witches, despite their utterly foreign appearance and inability to communicate. Sir Richard took them into his household. The community provided food and shelter. Priests tried to communicate with them. People worked patiently to help them adapt to normal life. This tells us something important about medieval attitudes toward the strange and unexplained. Medieval people certainly believed in supernatural forces. They lived in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural seemed permeable. But they also had practical experience with refugees, displaced persons, and people from foreign cultures. Strange appearance and unfamiliar customs didn't automatically mean supernatural origin. They knew that difference didn't necessarily indicate danger. The villagers of Woolpit saw suffering children who needed help, and they provided it without requiring complete understanding of where these children came from. The chroniclers who recorded the story also showed balanced judgment. Both Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were educated men experienced in distinguishing reliable from unreliable accounts. That they chose to document this story suggests they found it credible even if they couldn't fully explain it. They interviewed witnesses. They provided details about what happened to the children afterward. They treated it as a genuine mystery worthy of serious attention rather than dismissing it as obvious fantasy. The girl eventually integrated into English society. She was baptized and given the Christian name Agnes. She learned to live normally among the villagers. Some accounts suggest she eventually married and had a conventional life, though she remained slightly different from those around her. People who knew her described a certain otherworldly quality, a thoughtfulness and seriousness that set her apart. Whether this reflected her traumatic origins or was simply her personality, we cannot know. Throughout history, people have encountered refugees, disaster survivors, individuals with unusual medical conditions. Children especially might end up far from home with no clear memory of how they travelled or where they came from. Severe trauma can impair memory formation. Malnutrition affects cognitive function. Young children separated from families during crises might be unable to provide coherent accounts of their origins even after learning new languages. The story patterns we call fairy tales might actually preserve cultural memories of real encounters with people whose origins and circumstances were mysterious to their hosts. The green children of Woolpit remind us that the medieval world was more complex and interconnected than we sometimes realise. People moved across great distances under circumstances that separated them from families and communities. Trade routes carried not just goods, but also refugees, pilgrims, and displaced persons. Children could end up in foreign lands through kidnapping, slavery, family flight from persecution, or simply getting lost during travel. But whether they were Flemish refugees, mining village survivors, or something else entirely, their story illustrates remarkable compassion. Faced with children from unknown backgrounds speaking an incomprehensible language and displaying what seemed like supernatural characteristics, the people of Woolpit responded with kindness rather than fear. They didn't need to understand where the children came from to recognize they needed help. They didn't require normal appearance or familiar speech to extend basic human decency. As we sit in the quiet hours of early morning thinking about those villagers who found 2 green children near ancient wolf pits and decided to care for them, we might ask ourselves how we would respond to such strangeness today. Would we be as willing to welcome the unexplained? Would we have patience to help otherworldly visitors adapt to our world? The green children vanished into ordinary medieval life, but their story remains as a reminder that truth often comes in forms we don't expect from places we can't imagine. Sometimes the most important response to mystery isn't solving it, but extending kindness to those who carry it with them. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in understanding, but in caring anyway. The green children of Woolpit challenge us to remain open to the impossible, while remembering that every mystery, no matter how strange, involves real human beings who deserve compassion and help. The fire burns lower as we move toward our next story. This one involves a cure so bizarre that doctors dismissed it for centuries as Italian superstition. Dancing as medicine for spider bites? It sounded like the kind of folk nonsense that proved medieval medicine was pure theatrical nonsense. Then modern researchers began studying the actual spiders involved and the psychology of the cure itself. What they discovered changes everything we thought we knew about the relationship between mind, body, and healing. Imagine you're working the olive harvest in southern Italy on a sweltering August afternoon in the year 1612. The sun beats down mercilessly. You reach into the silvery green foliage to pluck another handful of olives when you feel a sharp pain in your ankle. Looking down, you see a large spider scuttling away through the dry grass. Within hours, you're restless, agitated, filled with an irresistible compulsion to move. Your family doesn't call for a physician, they call for musicians. The village doctor arrives, examines the bite, and nods gravely. Tarantism, he declares. The only cure is the tarantella. Soon your home fills with the sound of tambourines, guitars, and mandolins. They play specific melodies at particular rhythms while you begin to dance. Slowly at first, then with increasing vigour and grace. You dance for hours, sometimes days, until you collapse from exhaustion. Upon awakening, you're completely cured. The spider's venom has been danced from your body. To modern medical historians, this sounded like textbook folk nonsense. Spider bites causing uncontrollable dancing. More dancing as the cure. It seemed like perfect evidence of pre-scientific medicine at its most irrational. Surely this was just another medieval superstition with no connection to reality. Another example of theatrical ritual masquerading as medical treatment. But researchers investigating both historical records and the actual spiders involved discovered something remarkable. The tarantella cure was based on sophisticated observations of real medical phenomena. The treatment was often surprisingly effective, though not for the reasons medieval Italians believed. What seemed like pure superstition turns out to have been an early form of what we now call psychosomatic medicine, addressing the complex interplay between mind and body in ways modern healthcare is only beginning to fully appreciate. Let's start with the spider itself. The European wolf spider, Lycosa tarantula, is indeed found throughout southern Italy. Its bite can produce significant symptoms, localized pain and swelling certainly, muscle cramps and spasms in some cases, nausea and sweating occasionally. But what made tarantula bites special in the medieval imagination wasn't their physical effects, it was how medieval healers had learned to treat the psychological response to being bitten. Here's the key insight that modern researchers uncovered. many symptoms attributed to spider bites were actually consistent with anxiety disorders and panic attacks. The spider bite might cause some initial physical discomfort, but the major disability often came from the victim's psychological response to being bitten. In medieval southern Italy, tarantula bites were believed potentially fatal. The fear and anxiety this belief produced could trigger cascades of psychological and physiological symptoms far more debilitating than actual venom effects. Think about it. You've been bitten by what your culture tells you is a deadly spider. You expect to die or at minimum suffer terribly. That expectation alone can produce panic attacks, hyperventilation, muscle tension, rapid heartbeat, sweating, trembling, and an overwhelming sense of doom. These are real physical symptoms with genuine physiological bases, but they're driven by psychology rather than venom. And the tarantella cure addressed these symptoms through sophisticated combinations of physical activity, social support, and altered consciousness that modern medicine recognizes as genuinely therapeutic. The vigorous dancing served multiple functions. It discharged muscle tension and nervous energy built up from anxiety and fear. It increased circulation, promoting toxin elimination through sweating regardless of whether actual toxins were present. It triggered endorphin release that reduced pain and promoted feelings of well-being. It provided intense physical activity that exhausted the body in ways that could break the cycle of anxious hyperarousal. All of these effects are now well documented in modern sports medicine and psychology, but the social dimension was equally important. Tarantism treatment involved entire communities. Musicians gathered to provide necessary music. Family and neighbours offered support and encouragement. Victims found themselves at centres of elaborate healing rituals demonstrating community commitment to their recovery. This social support reduced isolation and fear, provided positive reinforcement for recovery efforts, and created structured frameworks for healing that gave both patients and caregivers clear roles and expectations. Perhaps most significantly, the tarantella utilized what we now recognize as therapeutic dissociation. Rhythmic music, vigorous movement, and focused social attention combined to produce altered states of consciousness that could break cycles of anxiety and fear. The dancing became a form of moving meditation, allowing victims to enter trance-like states where normal thought patterns were suspended and psychological reset could occur. Modern research into dance therapy confirms many principles underlying the tarantella cure. Rhythmic movement produces therapeutic effects for wide ranges of psychological and neurological conditions. Dance therapy is now used to treat everything from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder to Parkinson's disease and chronic pain conditions. The specific rhythms and melodies used in tarantella music have measurable effects on brain activity and autonomic nervous system function. Fast, driving rhythms synchronize brainwaves in ways that promote altered consciousness. Repetitive patterns induce meditation-like states that reduce anxiety and promote healing. The social interaction inherent in the music and dance activates neural networks associated with bonding and trust. Even the physical exertion to the point of collapse serves a purpose, providing a clear endpoint to the ritual and allowing both patient and community to feel that something definitive has been accomplished. Archaeological evidence supports the sophistication of tarantism treatments. Excavations of medieval sites in southern Italy have uncovered musical instruments, specialized dance spaces, and artifacts associated with healing rituals. Chemical analysis of pottery fragments has revealed traces of substances that may have enhanced therapeutic effects. Herbs and compounds with mild psychoactive or analgesic properties that could be consumed as teas or applied topically during treatments. Renaissance medical treatises describe tarantism in remarkable detail and provide specific treatment instructions. Church records show religious authorities often participated in or sanctioned tarantella ceremonies, seeing them as legitimate healing rather than dangerous superstition. Some priests integrated tarantella elements into religious festivals, creating hybrid rituals that served both spiritual and therapeutic functions. Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century Jesuit scholar, wrote what may be the first systematic medical description of tarantism. His work shows that educated observers recognized it as a complex phenomenon, requiring careful observation and systematic treatment. Kircher noted that different victims responded to different musical approaches. Some required fast driving music, others needed slower melancholy melodies. Some danced alone, others needed partners or group participation. Successful treatment required skilled musicians and experienced healers who could read victim responses and adjust therapeutic approaches accordingly. Modern ethnomusicologists studying traditional tarantella music still performed in southern Italy have found remarkable sophistication in its structure and performance practices. The music is designed to be highly flexible and responsive, with built-in mechanisms for adjusting tempo, rhythm, and emotional intensity based on dancer needs. Expert musicians can maintain continuous play for hours, while subtly varying the music to guide dancers through different psychological and physical states. But tarantella cures also served important social and cultural functions beyond individual healing. In rigid medieval social hierarchies, tarantism provided acceptable outlets for emotional expression and physical release, particularly for women and lower class members who had few other opportunities for such release. Many cases of tarantism may actually have been what modern medicine calls conversion disorders. These are psychological conditions where emotional distress manifests as physical symptoms. Spider bites provided culturally acceptable explanations for behaviours and feelings that might otherwise have been seen as sinful, shameful, or socially unacceptable. The tarantella allowed people to experience ecstatic states, express deep emotions, and receive community attention in ways otherwise forbidden. It provided temporary escape from social restrictions while reinforcing community bonds and cultural traditions. This helps explain why tarantism persisted so long and resisted suppression by medical and religious authorities who became increasingly skeptical of folk healing practices. It served psychological and social functions that went far beyond treating spider bites. It was a pressure release valve for communities living under intense social control. It was a mechanism for integrating marginalized individuals back into community life. It was a tradition that preserved cultural identity in the face of homogenizing forces. Archaeological evidence from tarantism sites reveals the rituals weren't random or chaotic. They followed specific patterns and sequences: preparations before dancing, prescribed musical progressions, expected behaviours for participants and observers, post-ritual integration practices. The entire system was as structured and formalised as any medical protocol, just based on different theoretical frameworks than modern biomedicine. Some modern researchers have even suggested that the tarantella cure may have been deliberately therapeutic from the start rather than arising from genuine belief in spider venom. Healers may have understood that the ritual works psychologically while using the spider bite as a convenient explanation that made the treatment culturally acceptable. This interpretation is controversial, but it's supported by evidence that some healers could reliably predict which patients would benefit from tarantella treatment and which required different interventions. Today, as we rediscover therapeutic values of dance and movement, the tarantella cure no longer seems like primitive superstition. Instead, it appears as sophisticated holistic medicine, addressing complex interplay between physical symptoms, psychological distress, and social isolation that characterizes many forms of illness. The practitioners of tarantism understood something modern medicine is only beginning to fully appreciate. Healing is not just a physical process, it's a psychological, social, and even spiritual journey that requires addressing the whole person within their community context. The next time you see someone dancing with abandon, lost in rhythm and movement, remember the victims of tarantism who found healing through the same combination of music, movement, and human connection. Their cure began with a spider's bite, but led to discoveries about healing power of dance that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand and validate through scientific research. As we move through the deep hours before dawn, we might listen for ghostly echoes of tarantella music still sounding in Italian olive groves, eternal rhythms calling us to dance our way from sickness to health, from isolation to community, from the venom of our fears to the medicine of movement and song. But not all medieval healing involved dancing or community rituals. Some involved the solitary pursuit of ultimate transformation itself, the quest to turn lead into gold and discover the secret of eternal life. In the deep stillness before dawn, when medieval alchemists would tend their furnaces and peer into bubbling retorts by flickering candlelight, let me tell you about history's most famous impossible quest. The search for the philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that could turn lead into gold and grant eternal life to whoever possessed its secrets. For centuries, serious historians treated this as the ultimate medieval wild goose chase, a cautionary tale about what happens when magical thinking replaces rational inquiry. The whole enterprise seemed like pure fantasy that led otherwise intelligent people to waste their lives pursuing impossible dreams through incomprehensible procedures wrapped in mystical nonsense. Alchemists spent decades heating metals, mixing strange substances, performing elaborate rituals, all in pursuit of transformations that violated basic principles of matter and energy. It was embarrassing evidence of how far medieval people were from genuine scientific understanding. But as researchers began examining alchemical texts more carefully, and archaeologists uncovered actual medieval laboratories, a very different picture emerged. The alchemists weren't deluded treasure hunters. They were systematic experimenters who developed fundamental techniques that became the foundation of modern chemistry. Their quest for the philosopher's stone, far from being pure fantasy, was based on careful observations of real phenomena they interpreted through the conceptual frameworks available to them. Here's what's genuinely fascinating and what modern chemistry has been forced to acknowledge. Medieval alchemists were actually making legitimate chemical discoveries even when they interpreted results through theories we now know were incorrect. Archaeological excavations of alchemical laboratories have uncovered apparatus and residues, demonstrating remarkably high levels of technical skill and scientific methodology. They developed distillation, sublimation, and crystallization techniques that weren't significantly improved until the 18th century. They created new types of glassware and heating systems, allowing precise temperature control. They systematically recorded procedures and results in ways that allowed work to be replicated and refined by later practitioners. This was genuine experimental science, even if the theoretical framework differed from modern understanding. One of the most remarkable aspects was the empirical foundation underlying all the mystical language. Despite symbolic imagery and obscure terminology, alchemists were careful observers who based theories on repeated experimentation. They might interpret results through concepts like sympathies and signatures, but they achieved those results through systematic manipulation of real chemical processes. Modern analysis of alchemical texts has revealed sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and chemistry hidden beneath symbolic language. When an alchemist wrote about the marriage of the Red King and White Queen, they were often describing specific chemical reactions between metallic compounds. References to death and resurrection of metals documented what we now call oxidation and reduction processes, still fundamental to modern chemistry. The search for the philosopher's stone led to numerous practical discoveries with immediate economic value. Alchemists developed new techniques for refining precious metals, making them purer and more valuable. They created pigments for artists that were more stable and vibrant than anything previously available. They synthesized medicines that genuinely helped patients, even if the theoretical explanations for why they worked were completely wrong. They discovered phosphorus, antimony, and numerous other elements and compounds that became essential to later chemistry. They created new alloys and metalworking techniques that revolutionized everything from weapons manufacturing to architectural decoration. They developed methods for making acids and bases that became crucial for industrial processes. All of this came from the quest for an impossible transformation. But perhaps most significantly, they developed systematic approaches to experimentation and record-keeping that laid groundwork for the scientific method. Alchemical laboratories were the first organized research facilities in European history, where practitioners worked systematically toward long-term goals, documented procedures carefully, and built upon each other's work across generations. This infrastructure and methodology became the template for modern scientific research. The apparent failure to achieve transmutation now looks less like fundamental error than like attempting through chemical means what we know requires nuclear processes. Medieval alchemists were trying to change atomic structure using techniques that could only rearrange molecular structures. Their goal was actually achievable, just not with available tools and energy sources. Modern nuclear physics confirms that elements can indeed be transmuted, exactly what alchemists claimed was possible. Gold can be created from lead through nuclear bombardment in particle accelerators. The process cost far more than mining gold from Earth, so it's economically pointless. But it's physically possible. The alchemists' theoretical understanding was essentially correct. They simply lack the technology to manipulate matter at the atomic level, rather than the molecular level. Even more remarkably, some alchemical procedures may have occasionally produced actual transmutation through mechanisms not understood at the time. Recent research suggests certain high-temperature chemical processes, particularly those involving electrical phenomena, might be capable of producing low-level nuclear reactions under specific conditions. Some medieval procedures may have inadvertently created these conditions, leading to small-scale transmutations that would have seemed miraculous. The pursuit of immortality through alchemical means also turns out to have been more rational than once believed. Medieval alchemists developed sophisticated theories about aging and death that led them to experiment with compounds and procedures that could genuinely extend life and improve health. Many alchemical preparations were essentially early pharmaceuticals addressing real health problems through systematic application of chemical knowledge. Alchemists created pharmaceutical compounds that are still used today in modified forms. They developed techniques for purifying water and food that reduced disease transmission. They discovered substances with genuine therapeutic properties, even if their explanations for how these substances worked were incorrect. Their concept of the elixir of life wasn't just wishful thinking. It was based on careful observations of effects various substances had on health and longevity. While they couldn't achieve literal immortality, they developed treatments that extended lifespans, reduced pain and suffering, and improved quality of life in meaningful ways. In an era when average life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years, any technique that added even a few years was genuinely valuable. Alchemical medicines probably did extend lives, just not the eternal time spans their creators hoped for. The mystical language that seemed so obscure wasn't just pretentious obscurantism. It was practical necessity in a world where too much chemical knowledge could be dangerous to possess. Techniques for creating explosives, poisons, or economically valuable substances had to be protected from political authorities who might seize them and from competitors who might steal them. The symbolic language allowed alchemists to share knowledge with other practitioners while keeping it hidden from outsiders. The alchemical tradition also provided one of the few intellectual frameworks allowing medieval scholars to investigate natural phenomena without direct conflict with religious authority. By embedding research within spiritual and philosophical contexts, alchemists could pursue empirical studies that might otherwise have been forbidden or dangerous. They could experiment with matter and energy while maintaining that their ultimate goal was spiritual enlightenment rather than mere material gain. Modern historians now recognize alchemy as a crucial transition between ancient craft traditions and modern scientific method. Alchemists preserved and systematized practical knowledge accumulated over centuries. They developed theoretical frameworks and experimental techniques later adopted by pioneers of modern science. They created the institutional structures and professional networks that became the template for scientific communities. Figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and other founders of the scientific revolution were deeply influenced by alchemical ideas and practices. Newton spent more time on alchemical experiments than physics. His understanding of matter, force, and transformation was shaped by alchemical concepts even when he was developing the mathematical laws that would revolutionize science. Boyle's pioneering work in chemistry emerged directly from his alchemical investigations. As we sit in quiet hours before dawn, thinking about those practitioners who tended fires and watched retorts bubble in hope of discovering ultimate secrets of transformation, we might reflect on complex relationships between dream and discovery, aspiration and achievement. The alchemists never found their philosopher's stone in the form they imagined, but they found something perhaps more valuable. They found knowledge and methods that would eventually allow humanity to understand and control the material world in ways their predecessors could hardly imagine. Their golden dream led to discoveries more precious than gold, systematic methods of investigation that became modern science, practical techniques that became modern technology, conviction that human intelligence could unlock nature's deepest secrets through patient observation and careful reasoning. The Philosopher's Stone may still elude us in its literal form, but the quest continues in every laboratory where researchers work to understand fundamental processes of matter and energy, in every attempt to extend human life and reduce suffering, in every effort to transform base materials of existence into something more precious and perfect. The alchemist's legacy lives on not in successful transmutation, but in the conviction that transformation is possible, that nature's secrets can be discovered, and that human ingenuity can achieve things that once seemed impossible. The sky begins to lighten outside our windows as we move toward dawn. But before we emerge fully into morning light, there are darker stories still to tell. Our next tale involves a creature so fearsome that it terrorized an entire region of France for 3 years. The Beast of Gévaudan seemed like obvious legend, another monster story invented to frighten children. Until researchers examined the bureaucratic records and discovered that every attack, every victim, every detail was meticulously documented by French authorities trying desperately to stop something they couldn't understand. The region of Gévaudan in what is now southern France was a rugged country in the 1760s. Forested hills, rocky outcroppings, isolated farming communities where wolves were a known danger, but rarely more than a manageable problem. Farmers lost the occasional sheep. Travellers learned to move in groups, but wolves were part of life, understood and dealt with through methods refined over centuries. Then, in the summer of 1764, something changed. The first documented victim was a young woman named Jeanne Boulet, killed near the village of Les Houbacs on the 30th of June, 1764. What made her death extraordinary wasn't just the violence, though that was shocking enough. It was the precision. The creature had targeted her throat and head with what seemed like surgical accuracy, leaving the rest of her body relatively untouched. This wasn't random wolf savagery or defensive animal attack. It seemed almost calculated, almost intelligent. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered. The pattern was consistent and deeply disturbing. Victims were predominantly women and children, often found with throats torn out but otherwise largely unmolested. The creature didn't seem interested in eating its victims. Most bodies were left almost intact, behaviour completely inconsistent with normal predator patterns. Wolves kill to eat. This thing seemed to kill for reasons no one could fathom. Local authorities initially assumed they were dealing with an unusually large, aggressive wolf, but as attacks continued and witnesses provided descriptions, it became clear something unprecedented was stalking the region. The creature was described as larger than any wolf, with reddish-brown fur marked with a dark stripe down its back. It had an enormous head, powerful jaws, and eyes that witnesses swore glowed with almost human intelligence. Some reports mentioned a tail unlike any wolf's tail, thick and muscular like a lion's. What made the beast more than a legendary monster was the systematic documentation by French authorities. This wasn't medieval folklore transmitted through oral tradition and embellished over centuries. This was 18th century bureaucracy applied to an apparent supernatural threat. Royal officials compiled detailed reports of each attack, including victim descriptions, witness statements, and physical evidence found at scenes. Military units were dispatched to hunt the creature. Bounties were offered for its capture. The investigation was conducted with methodical thoroughness that modern law enforcement would recognize. Between 1764 and 1767, official records document over 100 attacks attributed to the beast, resulting in somewhere between 60 and 100 deaths, depending on which sources you consult. Victims range from young children barely able to walk to adults in their prime. The majority were adolescents and young women, often attacked while tending livestock or walking between villages. Attacks occurred across a wide geographic area, suggesting the creature was highly mobile and covered significant territory systematically. What made the case even more puzzling was the creature's apparent intelligence and adaptability. It seemed to learn from human attempts to trap or kill it, changing behavior patterns and avoiding areas where hunters had set ambushes. It displayed what witnesses described as almost human cunning, leading some to speculate it might be supernatural or demonic rather than a natural animal. Priests performed exorcisms, villages organized prayer vigils. But the attacks continued. The French government took the threat seriously enough to send professional wolf hunters, military units, and nobles with private hunting parties to Gévaudan. King Louis XV became personally involved, offering substantial rewards and dispatching royal huntsmen to the region. The most famous was François Antoine, the king's official gun-bearer, sent to Gévaudan in 1765 with explicit orders to kill the beast and restore order. After months of unsuccessful hunting, Antoine claimed to have killed the beast in September 1765, presenting an unusually large wolf as proof. The animal was stuffed and sent to Versailles, where it was displayed as evidence that the terror had ended. But attacks continued after Antoine's departure, leading to renewed panic and the realization that either the creature was still alive or there were multiple beasts operating in the region. This pattern repeated several times over the 3-year period. Hunters would claim victory, presenting dead wolves as the beast. Authorities would declare the crisis over. Then new attacks matching the same distinctive pattern would occur, proving that whatever was killing people in Gévaudan was still active. The repeated false alarms damaged credibility of both hunters and officials, while terrorizing a population that no longer knew what to believe. For modern researchers, the abundance of official documentation is both blessing and curse. We have detailed records that prove something genuinely unusual was happening in Gévaudan, but the material includes contradictory accounts, obvious exaggerations, and the folkloric embellishment that tends to accumulate around traumatic events. Separating signal from noise requires careful analysis of which details appear consistently across multiple independent sources and which seem like later additions. However, careful study has led most experts to conclude the beast was most likely a real animal, or series of animals rather than supernatural entity. The question is, what kind of animal could account for the specific attack patterns and apparent behavior? The most widely accepted theory proposes that the beast was an unusually large, aggressive wolf, possibly a wolf-dog hybrid that had learned to prey specifically on humans. Wolves generally avoid human contact when possible. But individual wolves can occasionally develop what's called aberrant behavior, learning to prey on humans, particularly if exposed to human corpses during wartime or raised in contact with people. A wolf that lost its natural fear of humans could become extremely dangerous, especially if it learned that humans, particularly small humans like children, were easier prey than wild animals. A wolf-dog hybrid might combine the size and strength of large dog breeds with the hunting instincts and intelligence of wolves, creating a creature that was both physically formidable and behaviourally unpredictable. Such animals might be more willing to approach humans than pure wolves while retaining superior hunting abilities. This theory gains credibility from witness descriptions that included characteristics more dog-like than wolf-like, broader heads different from wolf proportions, unusual ear shapes, behaviour patterns suggesting familiarity with humans rather than wild animal wariness. The creature's apparent fearlessness when confronted and tendency to target specific victim types could be explained by hybrid vigour combined with learned behaviour reinforced over time. An animal that successfully killed humans would learn that humans could be prey, especially vulnerable humans encountered alone in isolated locations. The intelligence witnesses described might simply reflect the problem-solving abilities seen in both wolves and dogs, combined in a hybrid that was smarter than either parent species. But some researchers propose even more exotic explanations. One theory suggests the creature might have been an escaped exotic animal, possibly a hyena or large cat imported from Africa or Asia as part of a private menagerie. The 18th century was a period when wealthy Europeans often kept unusual animal collections, and escapes were not unknown. A hyena would fit many witness descriptions remarkably well. Larger than wolves with distinctive reddish fur and darker markings along the back. Incredibly powerful bone-crushing jaws capable of the damage described in attack reports. Known intelligence and adaptability. The ability to make sounds that might be interpreted as almost human-like, which several witnesses reported. Hyenas also have behaviour patterns that could explain the beast's hunting preferences. They're opportunistic predators willing to attack vulnerable targets, including humans when other food sources are scarce. Their hunting style involves targeting throat and head, consistent with wound patterns documented in Gévaudan attacks. A hyena displaced from its natural habitat might behave very differently from one in the wild, potentially becoming more aggressive and less predictable. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers suggest the beast might have been a deliberate creation, a trained animal used by humans for purposes that remain unclear. The creature's apparent intelligence and adaptability could be explained if it had been trained to hunt specific prey types. Its ability to evade professional hunters might reflect not just animal cunning, but human guidance from someone who knew when and where hunts were being organised. This theory would explain some of the more puzzling aspects of the case, including why the attacks followed patterns that seemed almost calculated, and why the creature sometimes appeared to display knowledge of human tactics and responses. If someone was directing or protecting the beast, that person could have helped it avoid capture while continuing its reign of terror. Motivations for such actions remain speculative, but might include revenge against specific communities, attempts to destabilize the region for political purposes, or simply the actions of someone deeply disturbed. The final resolution came in June 1767, when a local hunter named Jean Chastel claimed to have killed the creature during a hunt organized by local nobility. Chastel's account differed from previous unsuccessful attempts in interesting ways. He claimed to have used bullets blessed by a priest, suggesting he believed the beast had supernatural qualities requiring religious intervention. He reported that the animal displayed almost supernatural resistance to ordinary ammunition, requiring multiple shots to bring down. The creature Chastel killed was described as unlike any wolf known in the region, larger than normal wolves, with unusual coloration and dental structure, with partially digested human remains in its stomach, providing gruesome confirmation that this animal had indeed been feeding on people. The body was preserved and sent to Versailles for examination by royal naturalists, but unfortunately decomposed before reaching court, leaving only skeletal remains and descriptions from those who examined it fresh. Attacks ceased after Chastel's kill, and the case was officially closed. But the mystery of exactly what the beast had been was never definitively resolved. The decomposed remains couldn't provide the certainty everyone sought. Debates continued about whether Chastel had killed a wolf, a hybrid, an exotic animal, or something else entirely. The lack of physical evidence that could be studied scientifically left the question permanently open. The Beast of Gévaudan case has become a touchstone for researchers investigating other historical monster reports. What makes it unique among legendary creatures is the quality and quantity of contemporary documentation. Unlike most monster stories that rely on folklore passed down through generations, the Gévaudan case was recorded by multiple independent observers using Enlightenment-era investigative techniques. We have official reports, witness testimonies, autopsy records, military correspondence, and financial accounts of bounties paid and expenses incurred. Yet despite this wealth of documentation, the fundamental question remains unanswered. The case ultimately represents something more complex than a simple monster story. It illustrates the collision between rationality and inexplicable phenomena, between systematic investigation and primordial fear, between scientific method and the limits of human knowledge. Here was a case thoroughly investigated using the best available methods, extensively documented by reliable observers, yet the fundamental question of what the beast actually was remains unanswered more than 250 years later. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Even our most rigorous attempts to understand the world can encounter phenomena that resist easy explanation. The beast may have been killed, but the mystery it represents continues to remind us that reality may contain elements exceeding our current understanding. The terror is over, but the questions remain, echoing through the centuries as a reminder that some truths remain elusive, no matter how carefully we search for them. As the sun rises higher and we move closer to full morning, let me tell you about a healing practice that seemed to violate every principle of rational medicine. Kings and queens who claim they could cure disease simply by touching the afflicted. It sounded like the ultimate medieval con, exploiting superstition to reinforce royal authority. Then researchers began studying the actual success rates and discovered something that challenges everything we think we know about the relationship between belief, psychology, and physical healing. Imagine suffering from scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that causes painful swelling of the lymph nodes in the neck, disfiguring lumps that mark you as unclean, fever that comes and goes, weakness that makes simple tasks exhausting. Medieval medicine offers little hope. Then you hear that the king himself possesses the power to heal with a simple touch. You travel for weeks to attend a special ceremony, joining hundreds of other sufferers hoping for a miracle. The king places his hands on your swollen neck and speaks the sacred words. The king touches you. God heals you. This was the royal touch, a healing ritual practiced across medieval and early modern Europe, where kings and queens claimed they could cure scrofula and other diseases through the divine power flowing through their royal blood. For centuries, medical historians dismissed this as transparent fraud, a cynical exploitation of popular superstition designed to reinforce royal authority by claiming supernatural powers. The idea that diseases could be cured by royal hands seemed like the ultimate example of medieval irrationality and the gullibility of superstitious peasants. But recent research into historical records combined with modern understanding of psychosomatic medicine and the placebo effect has revealed something that challenges our assumptions. The royal touch may have been far more than mere political theatre. It appears to have been genuinely effective medical intervention that produced real healing outcomes through mechanisms we're only now beginning to fully understand. Picture the elaborate ceremonies that drew thousands of sufferers from across Europe seeking healing power of royal hands. Patients would travel for weeks to attend special sessions, often held on religious holidays like Easter or major saints' feast days. They'd be examined by royal physicians to confirm their diagnoses, ensuring they actually had conditions the royal touch was believed to cure. Then they'd be brought before the monarch in carefully orchestrated processions that emphasized the sacred nature of the healing ritual. The king or queen would place hands on each patient while reciting specific prayers. In England, the formula was the king touches you, God heals you. In France, it was the king touches you, may God heal you. After touching, patients received specially minted coins called touch pieces, small medals blessed by the monarch, and believed to continue the healing process after the ceremony ended. These coins became treasured possessions, worn around the neck as ongoing sources of divine healing power. The entire ritual was designed to create a profound sense of spiritual significance and royal power. Patients didn't just receive medical treatment, they experienced direct personal contact with the most powerful person in their world, participated in ceremonies connecting them to divine authority, and became part of a sacred tradition stretching back centuries. The psychological impact of these experiences was enormous and probably central to why the treatment often worked. What makes these ceremonies particularly interesting to modern researchers is how systematically they were documented. Royal records include detailed lists of patients treated, their conditions, and often follow-up reports on their recovery rates. These records suggest success rates that would impress modern medicine. Estimates based on historical documents indicate that between 60 and 80% of patients reported significant improvement within months of royal touching ceremonies. For centuries, medical historians assumed these success rates were either completely fraudulent, the result of misdiagnosis where patients who would have recovered anyway were claimed as royal touch successes, or purely psychological with no real physical healing occurring. But modern analysis of historical records combined with understanding of actual medical conditions involved suggests a more complex and fascinating picture. Scrofula, the primary condition treated through royal touch, is now known to be a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes. Modern medical research has revealed that tuberculosis can indeed go into spontaneous remission, particularly in patients whose immune systems are strengthened through improved nutrition, reduced stress, and positive psychological states. The disease naturally waxes and wanes, with periods of active infection alternating with periods where symptoms diminish or disappear entirely. Many other conditions commonly brought to royal touching ceremonies, various skin diseases, joint problems, chronic inflammatory conditions, are also now known to respond significantly to psychological and social interventions. The mind-body connection in healing is no longer controversial in modern medicine. We understand that psychological states directly affect immune function, inflammation, hormone levels, and healing processes throughout the body. The royal touch ceremony provided exactly the kind of psychological and social support that modern research has shown to be therapeutically effective for many conditions. Patients received individual attention from the most powerful person in the kingdom, providing a profound sense of being valued and cared for. They participated in elaborate rituals affirming their dignity and worth as human beings despite their disease. They became part of a community of fellow sufferers supporting each other through the healing journey. The journey to attend the ceremony was itself therapeutically significant. Patients often travelled for weeks, staying in monasteries and religious institutions along the way. This journey removed them from stressful daily circumstances, providing rest and a change of environment. It gave them time for reflection and prayer. It created a sense of pilgrimage that enhanced the psychological impact of the eventual ceremony. By the time patients reached the royal court, they'd already undergone a transformative experience that prepared them psychologically for healing. Archaeological analysis of surviving touch pieces has revealed sophisticated understanding of materials and symbolism. The coins were made from precious metals, silver or gold, and minted with specific religious imagery designed to reinforce healing power. Chemical analysis shows they included trace amounts of antimicrobial metals that might have provided some physical protection against infection when worn against the skin. While this effect would be minimal, it suggests medieval understanding that materials themselves could contribute to healing beyond pure symbolism. Modern medical research has provided multiple explanations for why royal touch might have been genuinely effective despite being based on incorrect theories about divine kingship. The placebo effect, once dismissed as mere psychological trickery, is now known to produce measurable physiological changes. Brain imaging studies show that placebos activate the same neural pathways as active drugs. They trigger release of natural pain-relieving endorphins. They reduce inflammation. They enhance immune function. They accelerate healing processes throughout the body. Royal touch ceremonies were essentially designed to maximize placebo effects through multiple psychological mechanisms. The elaborate ritual, the personal attention from royalty, the social validation, the religious significance, the community support. All of these elements combined to create extraordinarily powerful expectations of healing. And modern research confirms that healing expectations directly influence healing outcomes through measurable biological mechanisms. But effectiveness went beyond simple placebo effects. The ceremonies provided what modern medicine recognizes as crucial therapeutic factors that enhance healing across many conditions. Stress reduction from the journey and ceremony itself, social support from the community of fellow patients, improved self-esteem from receiving personal attention from the monarch, integration into healing communities that continued providing support long after the initial intervention. For many patients, particularly those from lower social classes, royal touch may have been their first experience of being treated with dignity and respect by authority figures. They were accustomed to being ignored, dismissed, or actively mistreated by their social superiors. The experience of having the king or queen personally attend to their suffering, speak to them directly, and touch them with care could have had profound effects on their sense of self-worth and their belief in their capacity to heal. The decline of royal touch in the 18th and 19th centuries reflected changing attitudes toward monarchy and medicine, rather than recognition that it was ineffective. As Enlightenment rationalism challenged beliefs in divine right of kings, there was less social acceptance of the idea that royalty possessed supernatural healing powers. As scientific medicine developed more effective treatments based on germ theory and pharmacology, there was less need for healing practices depending on belief in royal divinity. But elements of the royal touch tradition persisted in other forms and influenced development of modern therapeutic approaches. The recognition that psychological and social factors play important roles in health and recovery became fundamental to modern medicine. The understanding that the therapeutic relationship between healer and patient matters as much as specific treatments administered became central to medical training. The insight that healing happens most effectively within contexts of genuine care, respect, and human dignity remains core to best medical practice. Today, as we rediscover the importance of the therapeutic relationship, as we recognize that healing involves treating whole persons rather than isolated symptoms, as we understand that belief and expectation directly influence health outcomes, the royal touch no longer seems like primitive superstition. Instead, it appears as sophisticated recognition of psychological and social dimensions of healing that modern medicine is still working to fully integrate into practice. The elaborate ceremonies that brought kings and queens into direct personal contact with their most vulnerable subjects represented a model of healthcare delivery that prioritized human dignity, community support, and holistic approaches to healing. While we may no longer believe in divine power of royal hands, we can recognize the wisdom of healing practices that treat patients as whole human beings deserving of respect, attention, and care. As morning light fills our windows and we prepare to move through the day ahead, thinking about those ceremonies where monarchs placed hands on the heads of suffering subjects, we might reflect on what they reveal about the nature of healing. Royal touch may have been based on incorrect theories about divine kingship, but it created healing relationships that genuinely helped people in ways that purely biochemical approaches sometimes fail to match. The divine right of kings may be gone, but the human right to compassionate, dignified care remains. Perhaps that's the real legacy of royal touch, not the questionable belief that monarchs possessed supernatural powers, but the enduring truth that healing happens most effectively when delivered within relationships of genuine care, when patients are treated with dignity, and when communities commit to supporting their most vulnerable members through suffering toward health. The sun climbs higher now, and we're moving toward our final stories. But there are still mysteries to explore, still truths hidden in the shadows of history waiting to be brought into light.